Why all the D20 hate? Please leave our poor boy alone. Hello, I'm Riley, and this is the Diegetic Advancement Podcast. Okay, today's episode is going to be an in-depth look at dice and mechanics, inspired by a video that Jason over at the Nerds RPG Variety Cast recommended in his latest podcast, the video by Ivan Mike, 1968, titled The D20 Mechanic is Not Swingy, Really. It ended up being the first in a series of videos discussing dice mechanics. It has also generated a fair bit of discussion on the Audio Dungeon Discord, so I want to cover some of the topics that Ivan talks about in these videos, and I have some differing opinions on some minor points that I'll share, and I'll jump into some of my own thoughts. Firstly, I want to start by saying for the Game Master, the understanding of how various dice and dice mechanics work is super important. You should read what the AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide has to say about the topic. There is a reason it's at the start of the book. And become familiar with a tool like any dice, which I'll cover later. In the first video, Ivan makes a great point, classifying dice mechanics into ones which you sort results or total results. I think the most common mechanics are those that fit into the sorts result category. So what does that mean? Well, when there are categories of outcomes like success and failure, though there can be more, it doesn't really matter what the number on a dice is, just that it fits into one of the categories. For example, a common skill check against a target number, you roll a d20, add your modifiers, and if the result is greater or equal to the target, you succeed, otherwise you fail. If the target was 10 and your result was 10, you succeed. If the result was 18, you still succeed. It doesn't matter. To contrast this, let's look at a total results mechanic where the actual number matters. Rolling for damage. A 1 on a d6 does very minimal damage, and a 6 does a lot. Every number in between produces a different effect. A common misconception is that the d20 is swingy, or more swingy than, say, 3d6. Ivan goes on to suppose that the d20 is not swingy when used for mechanics that fit into the sorting definition. He's of course correct and does a good job presenting this. But I think he makes a misstep in saying that the numbers are important in a Powered by the Apocalypse game, which uses 2d6. Even though you total the dice, the numbers are still not important. They are grouped into categories, and we could model the exact same odds using a single dice. Ivan, of course, points out that the d20 is more swingy than multiple dice due to the bell curve for total result mechanics when the actual numbers mean something. I'll present the common criticism. 3d6 creates a bell curve of results, with results trending towards the middle of the range. This is correct, with 50% of results being between 9 and 12, which is only 25% of the possible results. However, as Ivan explains very well, it does not matter when you add a target number. The chance of succeeding when the target number is 10 on a d20 is 55%. It is 62.5% for 3d6. Okay, is that more consistent? Yes, but these don't exist in a vacuum. You are the GM, you get to decide the target number, or the game designer did. If you want to give people a 50% chance to succeed, you set the target number for a d20 to 9, and you set the target number for 3d6 to 11. Now, both dice produce the same swinginess, 50% chance to succeed, 50% chance to fail. This is why, as a GM, you need to understand, at least on a basic level, how dice function. Unless your game already does the work for you, when we're playing games that require the GM to be game designers, which is almost all games because situations will come up that the rules don't cover, you will need to convert how difficult a task might be into game mechanics. Go check out the video. Ivan does a great job presenting the case with a number of examples, and he's since released 3 more videos that I'll put into 2 topics: degrees of success and knowing your chance of success, which I will cover now. Okay, I actually felt I was a little bit negative whilst recording this next section, so I just wanted to jump in and emphasize that I think Ivan has some really good critiques of some D20 systems, and they apply to the very common ones. They are definitely worthwhile taking on board and a great example of why understanding dice mechanics can lead to better games. Okay, Into degrees of success. What are degrees of success and failure? Well, in my sorting example earlier, I sorted results into two groups, success and failure. If instead you group them into more groups like critical failure, failure, success, and critical success, we now have degrees, meaning we can interpret from the dice not only did you succeed or fail, but how badly did you fail or how well did you succeed? In a video titled Why the D20 is Bad at Modeling Degrees of Success and Failure, Ivan backs up a claim he made in the first video that it's good that most D20 games don't use degrees of success. Firstly, he opens by making a great point. The D20 or any die is not better or worse than any other. And I'll echo this in saying that it's important to understand how each die functions in different scenarios, but no one die is better than another. Now back to the D20. I feel his video is more of a critique of systems like 5e and Pathfinder 2 rather than the die itself. He says that it's not a good die statistically or psychologically, and I'll take both of those claims separately. Firstly, statistically. He says it's got a few problems. One, using 1 and 20 as criticals. Competency isn't taken into consideration. No matter how big or small your bonus is, you will crit fail 5% of the time and crit succeed 5% of the time. This, of course, has nothing to do with the D20 as a die, because rolling a D100, we could say a 1 is a crit fail and a 100 is a crit success, and it'd be the same. Next, he looks at a model, I believe inspired by Pathfinder, where 5 above or below a DC is a better or worse result, and a 10 above or below is a much better or much worse result. He presents statistics using typical modifiers in a 5e game, ranging from +0 to +8, and goes on to say that the main issues with a system like this are that large modifiers negate the chance of bad failures, and no or low modifiers negate the chance of good success. And sometimes the DC is so low or so high that no one could ever get one of the elevated results. Of course, you could model this scenario with a D100 as well. You just times all the numbers he presents by 5, it works exactly the same. These examples are good critiques of D20 systems, but not the die. There's a lot to be gained from them. In understanding how these things work, we can choose whether or not to use them in a game or how to use them. One point I'll potentially disagree with, though, I don't think always having a chance of really bad fails or really good successes are necessarily a good thing. It's likely genre and playstyle specific. I think he runs short on time addressing the psychological aspect. He says the D20 has too many data points and that we can't effectively work out differences of, say, more than 3, using the 3 standard deviations as an example. I do not follow this logic 100%. D100 has more data points, and standard deviations are groupings. We can group the numbers on a D20 into categories to achieve the same effect. He also mentions 3 systems that can do degrees well: D100, dice pools, and 2d6. I'll get into these in the next section on knowing your odds. Lastly, he closes the video by saying, the D20 is bad at degrees of success, and we shouldn't try to make it do so. So that's what I'm going to try and do. A good degrees of success system would be basic role-playing, Call of Cthulhu, a D100 system rolling under your skill. If we look at a pre-gen character that I have for Call of Cthulhu, we can see that the character has a 40 in Persuade, which means they have a 40% chance to succeed. But there are 2 extra degrees, one for half and one for fifth of the original score. These are 20 and 8 respectively for a 20% chance of a hard success and 8% for a extreme success. We can simply convert this system to D20 roll under, and instead our character would have an 8 in Persuade, with a half score of 4 and a fifth score of 1.6, which means we have to do some rounding. The 8 and 4 have equal chances of success to the D100 counterpart, and depending on whether we round up or down, we have a 5% or 10% chance of an extreme success. We always round to the closest integer. We're only ever going to be 2% off, which is a value that I don't think matters because it's so small. Now, of course, we could have a dice pool made up of D20s, and we can model 2d6 relatively closely on a d20, and I'll post a link that looks at that in the show notes. Next, on to knowing your chances. I've put out 2 videos on this topic. Why are we terrible at knowing our chances on a d20? And does it matter if you know your chances in an RPG? Which was a response to a comment that I left in the first video. Ivan is spot on in both of these videos. D20 rollover is difficult to calculate. There's nothing complicated about it, but there are a few steps that you need to do. So doing this quickly during the game can be difficult. Compared to a D100 roll under, especially so. The number is just a chance, so there's no thinking required. I have 2 points to add though. The D20, despite being more difficult than the D100, is much easier than a lot of other systems to calculate and estimate. I'd mentioned I'd come back to dice pools. These are very difficult to calculate. Let's look at a D6 dice pool system where a 4, 5, or 6 is a success. Okay, so you roll 1 dice. The chance of getting 1 success is 50%. That's easy. What happens when we add an extra die though? Yeah, that's kind of easy too. It's 75%. And with 3, it's 87.5. We have this growth where each die is half as effective as the last. First is 50, then 25, plus 50 is 75, and then 12.5, which makes 87.5. Well, what if the target number was 6 instead of 4, 5, and 6? It's a 16.67% chance for 1 die, 30.56 for 2, and 42.13 for 3 die. Okay, that doesn't follow the half as effective rule. Now we know that if we need a 4, 5, 6, then the odds of getting 1 success on 1 die is 50%. How many die would we need to have a 50% chance to get 3 successes? Not 3, it's actually 5. There's a non-linear relationship. You need 9 dice to have a similar chance if we use a 6 as the target number. This fails the easy to calculate test and the easy to estimate test. 2d6 and 3d6 have a similar issue, not nearly as bad though, because there isn't a linear chance. It is difficult to work out the odds of success. It's also difficult to understand the effect of a +1, as it will be different depending on the modifiers a character already has and the target number. As I've talked about, not knowing the chance of success has its problems. The player can not accurately judge difficulty, and the GM will struggle to set difficulty classes or provide situational modifiers. If the game system uses a difficult mechanic like this, it should provide guidance on these things, otherwise players and GMs will have to spend a lot of time to work it out for themselves. Okay, so the D20 can be hard to calculate, but is it easy to estimate? I think so. And is it estimating good enough? I also think so. But I left a comment on Ivan's video which said, why do we need to know our chances on the D20? Is it not good enough to estimate? For example, if a target number is between 15 and 20, I know that it's unlikely. If it's between 0 and 5, I know that it is likely. And everything else in between is average enough. For me, this is enough information to judge whether or not I want to take a particular action in a game. I was a little bit loosey-goosey in the middle there. It probably needs another 2 or 3 categories to estimate, but I didn't want to type out a very long message. Ivan responded with an interesting point. So firstly, he said, we're bad at guesstimating, which I suppose is true. And the interesting point, I find people play differently when they play D100 games. Very often, they tend to play much more conservatively. Now, this is the interesting point because it harkens back to no one die is better than the other. Despite being able to model the same statistics on a D20 and a D100 near enough, it can cause different play. If we want our characters to be bold and attempt risky actions, the D100 might get in the way of that. If we want them to be cautious, then it could be a great die to choose. He then released a follow-up video titled, Does it matter if you know your chances in an RPG? He opens with a simple answer, no and yes, which is one of my favorite answers. I believe I've used it at least once on the show. And there are a lot of topics covered in this video. You should definitely go check it out. I don't think I have anything to add or comment on that I haven't already covered, but there's a lot in the video that is interesting that I haven't talked about. Okay, that was really long. I'll reiterate, Ivan's videos are really good. I'm glad Jason recommended the video originally. I highly recommend you to go check his channel out. I've subscribed and looking forward to more content. The link to his channel is in the show notes. Summarize some of the key points I've talked about. No one die is better than another, nor is one mechanic better than another. It's situational at best. Understanding dice statistics is really important as a GM and can be as a player. The D20 is not swingy when used in a sort mechanic, but can be in a total mechanic. The die doesn't exist in a vacuum. The target number and modifiers play a significant role. Knowing your odds is good, but I think estimating is good enough. And estimating can be very difficult for some mechanics. Guidance on setting target numbers and modifiers is needed. And the last point, why all the D20 hate? Please leave our poor boy alone. Okay, and I've just got a couple of additional points to make. Firstly, AnyDice, or some other tool. AnyDice is a great online tool that you should learn to use if you're interested in dice mechanics. It is very powerful at modeling dice. You can look at distribution of results, the chance of rolling over and or under, chance of getting specific numbers, model advantage and disadvantage, dice pools, basically anything you can imagine being in an RPG. Secondly, there's been some discussion around the Anchorverse around D20 versus 3d6 roll under stats. Okay, so 1d20 is not more swingy than 3d6 when looking at a target number. However, we've seen that looking at the same target number, they produce different results. So how about comparing that to stats, which for this example generated with 3d6. Let's assume a character with low stats has a 7, average stats has an 11, and good stats has a 15. How does each die work out? Well, the low stat character has a 30% chance of rolling under a 7 with a d20, and a 9% with a 3d6. The average stat has a 50% chance of rolling under an 11 with a d20, and a 50% chance with a 3d6. And the high stat character has a 70% chance of rolling under a 15 with a d20, and a 90.74% chance with 3d6. As Jason pointed out in the audio dungeon, 3d6 is the dice of power gamers. So if we use the 3d6 to generate our stats, using 3d6 to roll under them will emphasize good scores and punish bad ones, whereas the d20 is more quote-unquote balanced. Neither one of these is better than the other, but it is why it's worth considering these mechanics if you want to implement them into a game like BX, where I believe both of these have been used as examples in modules. There are other ways to generate stats, of course. Point buy, 46 not the lowest, 2d6 plus 4. And again, running these numbers in AnyDice is quick and worth considering as they will heavily impact your game. Okay, that's all for today. As with my previous skills discussion, I'll likely have more to say in the coming weeks. Okay, and onto content shoutouts. First up, obviously, Ivan. Go check out his YouTube channel. It's been the discussion point of the topic today. The Nerds RPG Variety Cast put out the episode which recommended the video in the first place. And Jason has also started a blog to detail his solo play. Just today, he put out his first actual session, a recap. Over on the Bandit's Keep, Daniel put out a podcast discussing whether simple systems are good for new players, and a YouTube video on creating a sandbox. Mark the Meek put out a podcast on travel mechanics and player morale. Really interesting. Go check that out. And if you've got some input, send that through because I'm interested to see where he takes that. Over on the Red Dice Diaries, do a small review of So You Want to Be a GM. Over on Monsters and Treasure, Daniel and KR talk about rest and downtime. Over on the Hindsightless podcast, Joe talks about his experiences running Deathfrost Doom, plus Wrath of the Righteous and various other topics. And lastly, Sameolji has a really interesting interview on role-playing the hard way. Really insightful, even though it's probably not the style of play that I go for. I really enjoyed listening to it. It was really informative. Okay, I've gone on way too long this week. I do have a handful of call-ins, but I think I'm going to give myself an easy week next week and save the call-ins for a call-in show next week. Same goes for any updates on the war game and my adventures at trying to get some groups started for some OD&D. That'll probably wait until next week as well. If anyone is listening, I'd love to hear your feedback. You can reach me via Spotify, SpeakPipe, Discord, or email. Details, along with everything I've talked about today, are in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening. Bye for now.